The colonel called her too slow. He based his assessment on the neat, sterile lines of her file, a document that painted a picture of a methodical analyst, someone more comfortable with spreadsheets than stick-and-rudder combat. He didn't know that for Major Evelyn Reed, slowness was a weapon, and in the 3 seconds it would take for him to regret his words, 5 enemy targets would be turned into digital dust. This was not a story of redemption, but of revelation. 1. Arrival. The air in the Aegis dome was cold and tasted of ozone and recycled oxygen. It was a cathedral of simulated warfare, a vast, circular chamber where the ceiling was a starless black and the floor was a polished obsidian that reflected the cobalt blue glow of 100 monitors. At its center, suspended in complex, gimbaled rigs, were the simulator's sleek predatory shapes that mimicked the Air Force's latest generation of fighters. Major Evelyn Reed stood just inside the main entrance, her presence a study in stillness. She held a datapad in one hand, but her eyes weren't on it. They were absorbing the room. Her transfer orders had been as sterile as the environment. Observer Controller, Project Eegis, a ground assignment. A supervisory role. To the pilots of the 77th Tactical Fighter Squadron, the legendary Wraiths, it was a babysitting job. They moved past her with the cocksure swagger of young men who believed they were immortal, their flight suits adorned with bravado-filled patches. They saw a woman of medium height, with dark hair pulled back in a severe regulation bun. They saw the silver oak leaf of a major on her collar, but it seemed out of place on someone who carried no aura of command, only an unnerving quiet. A few offered perfunctory nods. Most ignored her completely, their conversations filled with the technical jargon and inside jokes of a tight-knit tribe. Eve didn't mind. Anonymity was a cloak she had worn for most of her career. She cataloged their faces, the way they walked, the subtle hierarchies evident in their interactions. She saw the lead pilot, Captain Jester Davies, whose confidence bordered on recklessness. She saw his wingman, a younger, more nervous lieutenant who mirrored his leader's every move. And she saw their commander, Colonel Marcus Thorne, standing on the central command dais like a king surveying his court. He was a man carved from granite and procedure, with a jaw that seemed permanently set against compromise. Her stillness was not passive. It was a state of active processing. While the pilots saw the impressive hardware, Eve saw the power conduits running beneath the floor panels. She noted the subtle flicker in the backup generator's status light on a far wall, a half-second lag no one else would ever notice. Her ears filtered the ambient hum of the servers, discerning the faint, rhythmic click of a specific cooling fan that was 200 RPMs off its optimal cycle. Her mind was a constant, silent diagnostic. The calloused pads on her fingertips, a stark contrast to her otherwise unremarkable hands, drummed a silent, complex rhythm against the edge of her datapad. It was a pattern, a mental exercise in timing and sequence she had practiced for a decade in places far darker than this sterile dome. She was a weapon in cool-down mode, and no one here had the clearance to understand the heat she still radiated. 2. Dismissal. Colonel Thorne finally descended from his dais, his polished boots making sharp, authoritative sounds on the deck. He moved with the unshakable self-assurance of a man who had commanded the skies for 20 years. He stopped before Eve, his eyes giving her a quick, dismissive appraisal that traveled from her perfectly shined low quarters to the barren left shoulder of her uniform, where a combat unit patch should have been. "Major Reed," he said. His voice was a low baritone, accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I've reviewed your file." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Headquarters seems to think we need more analytical oversight." Eve met his gaze. Her own eyes were a deep, unreadable gray. "I'm here to observe and report on squadron readiness, Colonel." "Readiness?" Thorne scoffed, a faint smile touching his lips. He gestured towards the simulators where his pilots were strapping in. "My pilots are the sharpest in the Air Force. Their readiness is measured in Mach numbers and G-forces, not in reports. Your file reads like an accountant's resume. Logistics, threat assessment matrices, predictive resource allocation. It's all very methodical. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. This is a world of split-second decisions, Major. Instinct. We operate at the edge of the envelope. There's no time for deliberation. Frankly, your profile suggests you're too slow for what we do here. The insult was deliberate, a clean, sharp jab meant to put her in her place. He expected a flicker of indignation, a defensive rebuttal, some sign that the barb had landed. He got nothing. Eve's expression remained neutral, her posture unchanged. Her heart rate, had he been able to measure it, was a placid 60 beats per minute. Her inner world, however, was a different story. She wasn't offended. She was classifying him. Subject profile: Thorn, Marcus. Coronel, veteran pilot. High confidence in established doctrine. Protective of his subordinates. Dismissive of external methodologies. Potential weakness: over-reliance on aggression. Predictable tactical patterns. My background is in data analysis, Colonel, she replied, her voice even. Data is simply the history of past actions. The faster you can read that history, the quicker you can predict the future. Speed is relative. Thorne's eyes narrowed. It wasn't the answer he'd expected. It was too precise, too detached. It was the response of a machine, and it unnerved him slightly. We'll see, he said, turning his back on her. A clear gesture of dismissal. Just try to keep up, Major. Don't get in the way. He strode back to his command chair, leaving her standing alone as the Aegis dome's main lights dimmed and the simulation sequence began to boot up. She remained in the shadows, a silent observer, perfectly content to be underestimated. It was, after all, the one tactical advantage she never had to fight for. 3. Observation. For the next 3 hours, Eve didn't speak. She moved along the periphery of the command deck, a ghost in the machine. While Thorne and his controllers focused on the main tactical displays, the God's eye view of the simulated battle space, Eve had her datapad synced to the raw data feeds. She wasn't watching the dogfights. She was watching the numbers behind them. She saw things the others missed. She watched the fuel consumption rates of the Wraith pilots, noting Captain Davies' tendency to use his afterburner in aggressive, inefficient bursts that would leave him vulnerable in a prolonged engagement. She tracked the telemetry of their missile deployments, identifying a pattern. They almost always favored a high-G, offensive maneuver, firing at maximum range, a tactic that worked against standard AI opponents but would be easily countered by an enemy employing sophisticated electronic warfare. Her eyes scanned lines of code, scrolling down her screen, translating them into a language she understood better than English. Ping response time, 70 milliseconds. Latency spike on Wraith 3's comms link. ECM subroutine 4B is running a redundant cycle. She cross-referenced these tiny, fleeting data points with the squadron's official doctrine, which she had memorized that morning. A discrepancy emerged. Their communication protocols had a vulnerability, a tiny window during frequency hops where a dedicated signal jammer could isolate a single pilot. It was a 1 in 1,000 flaw, but in her world, 1 in 1,000 was a certainty waiting for the right moment. She moved to a secondary terminal, one used for monitoring the simulation's environmental systems. The technicians gave her a curious glance, but didn't challenge her. She ran a Level 3 diagnostic on the Aegis dome's power grid. There was again the flicker she'd noticed earlier. It was a minute power fluctuation, a dirty power issue from the base's main grid. Harmless for the lights and life support, but to the hypersensitive processors running the simulation, it could introduce microsecond data lags. An enemy exploiting that lag could, for a fraction of a second, exist in a place where the system said they weren't. They could fire a missile that, according to the simulation's own logic, was impossible. Colonel Thorne barked orders from his chair, his voice a confident roar as his pilots racked up kills against the standard training adversaries. He was proud, seeing only confirmation of his squadron's elite status. He was watching a performance. He was reading the script. She saw the overconfidence being hardwired into his pilots' reflexes. She saw the systemic flaws they were blind to. She wasn't just observing. She was performing a pre-mortem. She was watching them lose a battle that hadn't even started yet, and she was mapping every step of their coming failure. Her focus was absolute, her mind a quiet storm of analysis. The calluses on her fingers traced the bezel of her datapad, the silent rhythm quickening as she absorbed more and more data. She was building a model, constructing a kill chain, only it wasn't for the enemy. It was for the wraiths themselves. For pressure. All right, people, let's turn up the heat, Thorn announced, his voice booming over the comms. Run simulation Omega 7. Authorization. Thorn, Alpha 1. A murmur went through the control room. Omega 7 was a new protocol designed by an external command to be a stress test of the highest order. It was known to be unpredictable, adaptive, a beast. The holographic map at the center of the room flickered, then reformed into a new battle space, a dense, mountainous region under a stormy, low-visibility sky. Wraiths, you are escorting a high-value asset, the synthesized voice of a simulation controller announced. Red air is in the vicinity. Expect heavy resistance. The first few minutes were deceptively calm. The wraiths fell into their standard escort formation, a confident arrowhead slicing through the digital clouds. Then, the pressure began. It started not with a frontal assault, but with whispers of chaos. I've got ghost signals on my radar, Wraith 2, the young lieutenant, reported, his voice a notch higher than before. Hold formation 2, Captain Davies ordered, his tone clipped. It's just weather clutter. Don't get spooked. But it wasn't clutter. On Eve's screen, she saw sophisticated electronic warfare signatures blooming across the map. The Red Air AI wasn't just flying. It was hunting with information. The ghost signals multiplied, creating a confusing, unreadable tactical picture. Multiple bogies bearing 090. Angels 20, someone shouted. No, my scope's clean, another pilot contradicted. They're my 6. Panic, like a virus, began to infect the comms channel. The disciplined radio chatter dissolved into a cacophony of frantic calls. Fox 2. Splash. Wait, it was a decoy. I'm defensive. I'm defensive. Thorn leaned forward in his chair, his knuckles white where he gripped the console. Wraith's discipline. Davies, get control of your element, he barked. But Davies was overwhelmed. His aggressive instincts were useless against an enemy he couldn't reliably target. He ordered a hard turn, a textbook maneuver that the Omega 7 AI seemed to have been waiting for. From the cover of a mountain ridge, for hostile fighters materialized, perfectly positioned. Simulated hit. Wrath 3 ejected. The stark, digital letters flashed on the main screen. Mayday! Mayday! 3 is down. The situation cascaded. The formation, now broken, was picked apart with ruthless efficiency. The Red Air pilots weren't just skilled. Their tactics were fluid, unpredictable, and perfectly coordinated. They were exploiting the Wraith's communication breakdown, isolating them one by one. Simulated hit. Wrath 4 ejected. The control room was a pit of tension. Controllers were shouting conflicting information. Thorn's face was a mask of grim frustration. He was a master of a specific kind of war, a war of clear lines and honorable duels in the sky. This was something else. This was chaos, and it was consuming his squadron. Through it all, Eve Reed stood in the shadows, her expression unchanged. She wasn't watching the screens anymore. She was listening to the rising panic in the pilots' voices, her head tilted slightly, as if judging the precise moment a string, pulled too taut, would finally snap. 5 intervention. The breaking point came when Captain Davies, Jester, the squadron's ace, was himself cornered. 2 Red Air fighters were bracketing him, forcing him into a deep, energy-bleeding defensive spiral. His wingman, Wraith 2, was too far away to help, trying to fend off his own attacker. I can't shake him. I can't get a lock. Davies' voice was strained, the easy confidence stripped away, leaving only raw desperation. The comms were a mess of panicked breathing and garbled warnings. Thorn was about to shout another futile order when a new voice cut through the static. It was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion. Wraith Lead, this is Observer. Silence. For a full second, the chaos paused. In the control room, every head turned towards the shadowy corner where Major Reed stood. She hadn't moved to the main console. She had picked up a simple technician's headset, her eyes fixed on her own datapad, which was now displaying a three-dimensional wireframe of the engagement. "Disengage afterburner and pull to vertical," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Go full military power. They're expecting you to bleed speed at the apex." "Don't." Davies, acting on pure instinct born of desperation, obeyed. His fighter jet model on the screen clawed for altitude. "Their fire control radar can't resolve your trajectory against the ground clutter at this angle." Eve continued, her tone as placid as a lecturer's. "At 25,000 feet, cut throttle to 70% and deploy air brake for 1 second. It will force an overshoot." "An air brake? In a vertical climb? That's insane," one of the controllers muttered. But Davies did it. The effect was immediate and startling. The two pursuing fighters, predicting a standard Immelman turn, surged forward, their momentum carrying them past Davies's suddenly decelerating aircraft. For a fleeting moment, the hunters became the hunted. "You now have a firing solution on the trailing bandit," Rafe lead. "Fox 2, Eve stated. "Fox 2, Davies yelled, a new surge of adrenaline in his voice. On the screen, a missile leaped from his fighter and vaporized one of the red icons. "Wraith 2, Eve's voice shifted focus without missing a beat. "Your bandit is breaking east. He's trying to drag you over a known SAM site. Do not pursue. Brake hard left, vector 270, and descend to 500 feet. Mask your signature in the canyon." The young lieutenant complied instantly. The red icon on his tail, deprived of its target, circled once before speeding off. In less than 30 seconds, Eve Reed had dismantled the ambush. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't displayed a single shred of emotion. She had simply spoken, and with her words, she had imposed order on chaos. She had seen the entire, complex geometry of the battle, not as a pilot sees it from a cockpit, but as a mathematician sees an equation, and she had solved it. The simulation controller's voice cut in. Exercise paused. Exercise paused. The control room was dead silent. The pilots, slumped in their chairs, were breathing heavily. Colonel Thorne stood slowly, his eyes locked on the unassuming major who was now calmly hanging the headset back on its hook. Sixth shift. The silence that filled the Aegis dome was heavier than the roar of the simulated jet engines it replaced. It was a silence thick with confusion, awe, and the distinct, uncomfortable sound of rapidly crumbling assumptions. The young controllers and technicians stared, mouths slightly agape, at the woman who had just dissected the Omega-7 protocol with the cool precision of a surgeon. The Wraiths, listening in from their simulator cockpits, were quiet for the first time all day. Colonel Thorne walked down from the command dais, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. He stopped a few feet from Eve, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, burning curiosity. "Major Reed," he began, his voice low and devoid of its earlier condescension. "Where did you learn to do that?" Eve turned to face him, her gray eyes giving away nothing. She held his gaze for a moment before answering. "I analyzed the enemy's tactical doctrine and cross-referenced it with your squadron's response patterns. The Red Air AI was programmed to exploit predictable, aggressive maneuvers. I simply offered a less predictable solution." It was a perfect analyst's answer. It was also a complete evasion. Thorne knew it. He had spent his life around pilots. He knew the difference between academic theory and the visceral, intuitive understanding of three-dimensional combat. What she had done wasn't analysis, it was artistry. She had felt the rhythm of the fight and changed its tempo. "That wasn't data analysis, Major," Thorne pressed, his voice tight. "You saw the whole board. You anticipated their moves 3 steps ahead. That's not something you learn from a book." "All combat is data, Colonel," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Position, velocity, fuel state, missile trajectory. It's all just numbers. If you process them fast enough, prediction becomes certainty. Her placid, almost robotic explanation was more unsettling than any boast would have been. She was deflecting his questions, wrapping her inexplicable skill in a shroud of technical jargon. The mystery of who she was, and what she was, only deepened. The pilots were beginning to climb out of their simulators, drawn by the palpable tension on the command deck. They gathered at a respectful distance, their earlier smirks replaced with expressions of bewilderment. They had just been saved by the quiet woman they had written off as a paper pusher. Thorne stared at her, searching for a crack in her placid facade. He found none. He was a man who dealt in certainties, in the clear hierarchy of rank and skill. Major Evelyn Reed was an anomaly that his worldview could not accommodate. She was a quiet administrator who possessed the tactical acumen of a master strategist. "I see," he said finally, though it was clear he didn't. He looked from her to the main screen, where the pause simulation still showed the single, elegant kill she had orchestrated. "Run it back," he said to the lead controller. "Delete the last 5 minutes. Reset the scenario to the point of the ambush." He turned back to Eve, his eyes gleaming with a new, intense light. "This time," he said, his voice a challenge, "you're not going to be on the comms." He pointed a single, decisive finger at the lead simulator rig, Captain Davies' vacant cockpit. "You're going to fly it. Show me." 7-second test. A ripple of shock went through the assembled pilots. The colonel was putting an observer, an analyst with no flight time listed in her public file, into the lead seat for the most difficult simulation in the Air Force's arsenal. It was an unprecedented, almost reckless command. But no one spoke a word. Every eye was on Major Reed. Eve didn't hesitate. She gave a single, sharp nod. "Yes, Colonel." She walked towards the simulator rig with a steady, unhurried gait. The technicians, who had earlier ignored her, now scrambled to assist, their movements filled with a new, nervous deference. She waved them off. With an economy of motion that was almost hypnotic, she swung herself into the cockpit, her movements fluid and practiced. She strapped herself into the 5-point harness, her hands moving over the buckles and straps with an intimacy that spoke of countless hours spent in a cockpit just like this one. Her fingers danced over the control panel, initiating the startup sequence from memory. The cockpit displays flared to life, bathing her face in a green and amber glow. On the main screens outside, everyone could see her view. The canopy closing, the systems check running, the heads-up display, HUD flickering into focus. Thorne stood behind the main console, his arms crossed. "This isn't analytics, Major," he said, his voice patched into her helmet. "This scenario is designed to overwhelm. It requires instinct. Speed." His words were a final echo of his earlier insult, but now they sounded less like a dismissal and more like a warning. "Ready," was Eve's only reply. "Engage," Thorne commanded. The simulation snapped back to life. Eve, now as Wraith lead, was in the exact same position Davies had been in, deep in a defensive spiral, 2 hostiles locked firmly on her 6. But where Davies had been reacting, Eve was acting. The instant the simulation went live, her hands and feet moved in a blur. She didn't try to outturn them. She didn't try to dive for the deck. She did something that defied all conventional training. She chopped the throttle completely and hit the directional thrusters, a maneuver so violent and aerodynamically unstable it was called a Pankratof's Cobra, a move used in air shows, not in combat. Her virtual jet pitched up violently, its nose pointing straight back at her pursuers as its forward momentum continued. For a single, impossible second, she was flying backward, her guns pointing directly at the 2 bandits who were now overshooting her. The room gasped. Her thumbs were a blur on the stick's weapon controls. The HUD flashed with target locks. Beep, beep. 2 distinct, high-pitched tones. She didn't fire missiles. Too slow. She used the cannon. A stream of 30mm cannon fire, perfectly aimed, tore through the lead enemy fighter. Splash 1. She kicked the rudder, sending her jet into a flat spin to avoid the second bandit's panicked volley of fire. As he flew past, she corrected the spin, slammed the throttle to full afterburner, and fell in behind him. The fight was over before it began. "He's on the run," Wraith 2 called out, his voice filled with disbelief. "Negative," Eve said calmly. "He's bait." Just as she spoke, 3 new hostile signatures appeared on the radar, converging on her position. It was the trap, the impossible scenario. 5-on-1. What happened next would become a legend in the 77th Squadron. Eve didn't panic. She didn't run. She pushed the stick forward, diving straight towards the converging enemies, accelerating to supersonic speed. It was a move of utter insanity, a head-on charge against overwhelming odds. But she wasn't looking at them. On her datapad, she had identified the power grid flicker, the microsecond of system lag. She was timing her attack to coincide with it. As the distance closed to near zero, just as the 5 jets should have filled her screen, she made her move. She cut her engine, deployed the air brake, and fired a single flare, exploiting the exact millisecond of data lag she had discovered. To the simulation's AI, her heat signature momentarily vanished. To her, the 5 targets were laid out before her like a practice drill. Her movements were a symphony of deadly efficiency. Acquire lock. Fire. Acquire lock. Fire. Her voice was a low, steady cadence in the otherwise silent room. Fox 2. Splash 2-inch. Her jet rolled, evading incoming fire that was already on its way. Fox 2. Splash 3-inch. She pulled a high G turn that would have made a normal pilot blackout, lining up the next shot. Fox 3. Splash 4-inch. The final bandit, realizing the trap had been turned, broke and ran. Eve didn't chase. She had reserved 1 long-range missile. Fox 3. Splash 5-inch. From the start of the 5-on-1 engagement to the final missile call, less than 4 seconds had passed. The main screen displayed the results in cold, hard text. Red Air Forces neutralized. The sky in her cockpit was empty. The Aegis dome was utterly, profoundly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the cooling systems, the very system she had diagnosed hours before. Colonel Thorne stood frozen, his face pale, staring at the screen as if he'd just witnessed a violation of the laws of physics. 8. Reveal. Thorne moved as if in a trance. He walked to his command console, his eyes never leaving the simulator where Eve was calmly running the shutdown sequence. His mind was reeling, trying to process the impossible display of skill he had just witnessed. This wasn't a pilot. This was something else entirely. This was a force of nature wearing a flight suit. "Get me her full service record," he snapped at a nearby communications officer. "All of it. Override standard security protocols. Authorization. Thorne, Marcus, command level clearance, Omega, 7 debrief." The young officer fumbled with the keyboard, his hand shaking slightly. "Sir, her primary file is sealed above my clearance level." "I am aware," Thorne said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Use my command codes." Now, he leaned over the officer's shoulder, watching as the system churned through layers of digital security. Access denied. Access denied. Finally, with his highest level authentication, a new file flickered onto the screen. It was sparse, heavily redacted, a ghost in the machine. Her name was there, Major Evelyn Reed. But beneath it was a cross-reference designation, a name that existed only in whispers and classified after-action reports. Call sign Nyx. The name hung in the air like a specter. Thorne felt a cold chill run down his spine. Nyx, the primordial goddess of the night. A myth, a legend whispered by special operations teams to scare new recruits. A pilot so skilled, so deadly, she was used only for missions that officially never happened. Unit, 7th Special Operations Aviation Detachment, 7th SOAD. Night Stalkers. The unit was so secret most of the military didn't know it existed. They flew the shadows, the blackest parts of the map. The mission logs were almost entirely blacked out, solid blocks of redacted ink. But a few unredacted fragments told a terrifying story. Redacted sole survivor extraction under total ECM blackout, redacted. Direct action neutralized 5 high-value targets, redacted, 0 collateral. Deep infiltration operated solo, for 72 hours behind enemy lines redacted. The logistics and analytics assignment was a lie. A cover story so thin it was transparent, yet so audacious no one would ever question it. This wasn't a cool-down. It was a cage, a place to put a weapon of unimaginable sharpness while it recalibrated. From across the room, another voice spoke, low and gravelly. It was Master Sergeant Cole, a man who had been maintaining fighters since before most of the Wraiths were born. He had seen everything, and he had been watching Eve's hands on the controls, not the screen. "I'll be damned," he murmured to the technician beside him, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. The Cobra maneuver. The lag exploit. I heard stories out of Kandahar. They called her Nyx. Said she didn't fly the jet, she flew the code. Said she could see the Matrix. I thought it was just a ghost story. Thorne straightened up, his back ramrod straight. He finally understood. He hadn't been dismissing a major. He had been condescending to a living legend. The slowness he had perceived wasn't a lack of speed. It was an excess of control. She didn't react because by the time a threat appeared, she had already processed it, analyzed it, and decided its fate. The fight was over in her head before the first shot was ever fired. He looked at the file, then back at the simulator, where the canopy was now retracting, revealing Major Reed, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. 9. Respect. Eve unstrapped herself and swung out of the cockpit, her feet landing on the platform with a soft, near-silent tap. The entire population of the Aegis Dome, pilots, controllers, technicians, and one very humbled colonel, watched her every move. The air was thick with a new kind of silence, one born of awe. She walked towards the center of the room, her path taking her directly towards Colonel Thorne. He met her halfway. He didn't speak. Words were inadequate for what had just transpired. His own vocabulary of command and control had been rendered obsolete. How do you give an order to someone who operates on a plane of existence you can barely comprehend? He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He didn't see an analyst anymore. He saw the quiet, coiled intensity of a predator. He saw the deep, ancient tiredness in her eyes that only comes from seeing and doing things that cannot be unseen or undone. He saw the reason for her call sign. Nyx. She brought the night with her. Thorne stood tall, straightened his uniform jacket with a sharp tug, and drew himself to the position of attention. In the silent, cavernous room, he raised his right hand to his brow and rendered a slow, deliberate salute. It was the sharpest, most precise salute of his long and decorated career. It was not the perfunctory salute a colonel gives a major. It was the salute of a warrior to a master. It was an apology. It was an acknowledgement. It was an act of surrender to a skill so profound it defied rank. Eve stopped before him. She met his gaze, and for the first time, something flickered in her gray eyes, a glimmer of understanding. She returned the salute with a motion that was as economical and devastatingly precise as her actions in the cockpit. The effect was electric. Captain Jester Davies, standing with his fellow pilots, straightened his shoulders and brought his own hand up in a salute. Then the pilot next to him followed suit. One by one, in a chain reaction of pure, unadulterated respect, every uniformed person in the room, from a youngest airman to the most senior controller, snapped to attention and saluted Major Evelyn Reed. There was no order given. There was no protocol demanding it. It was a spontaneous, unanimous recognition of greatness. They weren't saluting her rank. They were saluting the legend that stood quietly before them. 10. Closure. Eve held her salute for a beat longer, her eyes sweeping across the room, acknowledging the gesture. Then, with the same crisp efficiency, she dropped her hand. The moment passed. The pilots and controllers slowly lowered their own hands, but the atmosphere in the Aegis Dome had been permanently altered. The hierarchy of rank remained, but a new, unspoken hierarchy of skill had been established, and she was at its apex. Later that evening, long after the simulators had been powered down and the Wraiths had departed for the day, Eve stood alone on the observation deck. The main lights were off, and the only illumination came from the immense, slowly rotating hologram of the Earth that dominated the center of the chamber. The deep blues and swirling whites of the planet cast shifting, ethereal patterns across her face. The adrenaline of the simulation had long since faded, leaving behind the familiar, quiet hum that was her natural state. She wasn't thinking about the pilots or the colonel or their newfound respect. That was all external noise. She was focused on the silence, the precious, hard-won quiet. Her hand rose, almost unconsciously, to her left eyebrow. Her fingers traced the faint, silvery line of a small scar, hidden mostly by her hairline. It wasn't from a training accident. It was a reminder of her last mission, of shrapnel from a surface-to-air missile that had detonated too close. A reminder of the screaming noise, the fire, the chaotic plunge from the night sky. A reminder of the cost. The transfer to this slow ground assignment hadn't been a punishment. It had been a necessity, a place to let the ringing in her ears finally fade, a place to quiet the ghosts. But the colonel had been wrong. She hadn't been sent here to get slower. She had been sent here to remember what it felt like to not be moving at the speed of combat, to exist for a moment in the calm space between heartbeats. She looked down at the empty simulator rigs, dark and silent below her. They were just machines, tools of a trade she knew too well. The respect she had earned today was gratifying in a distant, academic way, but it didn't change the truth. The skill was not a gift. It was a burden, one she would carry for the rest of her life. She was Nyx. She was the night. And even here, in the simulated daylight of the Aegis dome, she knew the darkness was never far away. She closed her eyes, embraced the silence, and for a moment was simply Evelyn Reed, a woman standing in the quiet glow of a distant world.